Rose was sitting on the porch of her house, enjoying the end of a sunny afternoon, when she saw the moving truck parked in front of the house next door. The house, which had been empty for months, would finally have a new resident. The movement caught her attention, and she became curious, peeking discreetly through the foliage of her small vegetable garden. A middle-aged, ordinary-looking man got out of the truck. He was wearing jeans and a grey t-shirt, and his grey hair was a little disheveled. He looked tired, perhaps from the journey or the exhausting task of organizing the move. Rose watched him for a moment, trying to assess her new neighbor. There was something about him that seemed ordinary, but at the same time, an aura of mystery surrounded him. Perhaps it was the fact that he was alone, with no help from friends or family for the move, or simply because he avoided looking around, keeping his focus on unloading the boxes. Determined to be friendly, Rose got up and walked over to the fence separating the yards. She waved and smiled, trying to look welcoming. "Hello, welcome to the neighborhood," she said enthusiastically. "I'm Rose. I live next door." The man looked at her quickly, just for a second. His eyes were dark, almost inexpressive, as if he was reluctant to make eye contact. He nodded slightly, but said nothing. He quickly looked away, took another box from the truck, and entered the house. Rose stood still for a moment, not knowing what to do. She felt a little disconcerted by her new neighbor's cold reaction, but decided that maybe he was just tired and didn't want to bother her. She shrugged and returned to her balcony, watching from afar as he continued to unload the truck, going back and forth from the house to the vehicle. The sun was setting, and a long shadow stretched across the yard of the house next door, seeming to engulf the new resident as he disappeared through the door. Rose didn't know why, but a slight shiver ran down her spine. She shook her head, pushing the feeling away. Just another shy neighbor, she thought. Hell settled in over time. But as the day turned to night, Rose continued to cast occasional glances at the house next door, trying unsuccessfully to catch a glimpse of the man through the darkened windows. The light in his room was on, but the curtain was closed, leaving only an undefined shadow behind the fabric. The feeling of being watched, however subtle, remained with her, without her being able to understand why. That night, as she got ready for bed, Rose couldn't help but think about her new neighbor. Something in her told her that there was more behind those inexpressive eyes than he let on. She decided that the next day she would make another attempt to get to know him. After all, living in a quiet neighborhood meant that everyone knew each other and helped each other out. Little did she know, however, that her curiosity was about to open the door to a series of events that would turn her peaceful life into a real nightmare. The next morning, Rose woke up to the usual sound of birds singing and the aroma of fresh coffee filling her kitchen. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, and she felt optimistic, determined to make it a productive day. As she prepared breakfast, her mind went back to her new neighbor. The man's distant behavior continued to bother her, but Rose decided not to let it get to her. He needed time to adjust, she thought. After drinking her coffee, Rose went out into the yard to water the plants. As she tilled the soil and tended the flowers, her eyes involuntarily turned to the house next door. The curtains in the living room were still closed, but there was a discreet movement behind them. Rose frowned, trying to see better. For a moment, she had the impression of seeing the outline of a figure standing behind the curtain, as if someone was watching her. She froze, trying to focus her vision. However, before she could confirm it, the figure disappeared, and the curtain drew back, as if no one was there. "I must be imagining things," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the discomfort. But as the days went by, Rose began to notice a pattern. Whenever she was outside the house, in the yard, or walking to her car, she had the feeling of being watched. A constant and subtle sensation, but impossible to ignore. And whenever she looked at the house next door, she saw movement behind the curtains, an undefined shadow that disappeared as soon as she tried to focus. Rose began to pay more attention, and one sunny afternoon, while pretending to prune a bush near the fence, she spotted him. The new neighbor was standing at the second-floor window, half hidden by the curtain, staring at her. He didn't move. He didn't make a point of hiding the fact that he was watching. He just stood there, like a statue. His gaze was cold and inexpressive, the same as the one he had given her on the day he moved in. Rose felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't a look of curiosity, or of someone trying to get to know their neighbors. It was an intense, almost obsessed look. She looked away quickly, feeling her heart racing. She tried to continue her task, but the knowledge that she was being watched made it impossible to concentrate. She decided to go into the house, hoping that the man would leave her alone. But when she turned to take one last look, he was still there, motionless, his eyes following her every move. During dinner, Rose tried to distract her mind, but the image of her neighbor watching her wouldn't leave her head. She found herself peering out of the kitchen window, trying to see if he was still there. The lights in his house were off, and the curtains were closed. Yet Rose felt a presence, as if he was still somehow aware of every move she made. That night, when she went to bed, Rose found it hard to sleep. The idea of having someone watching her continuously was disturbing. Maybe I'm overreacting, she thought, trying to rationalize. He's just strange. That doesn't mean he's dangerous. But deep down, a small voice was telling her that this behavior wasn't normal. Something was very wrong. Before closing her eyes, Rose decided that she would take action. Maybe she should talk to him again, try to get to know him better. Or maybe she should talk to some of the other neighbors, see if they had noticed anything strange. Either way, she needed to do something to dispel this unsettling feeling. Little did she know that the decision to ignore her instincts and try to rationalize her neighbor's behavior would only deepen the mystery, leading her to discover secrets that would be better left hidden. Over the next few days, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she left the house, even for everyday tasks like picking up the newspaper or watering the plants, she felt her new neighbor's eyes fixed on her. The discomfort began to turn into mild paranoia. She began to avoid going out into the yard as often, preferring to stay indoors, where at least she had the illusion of privacy. However, the signs that something was wrong kept coming. One night, as Rose was getting ready for bed, she noticed a light flickering in the neighbor's house. She peeked out of her bedroom window, which had a partial view of his house. The lights on the second floor were flashing intermittently, as if someone was flicking the switch on and off repeatedly. The pattern was erratic and made no sense, almost as if it were sending some kind of message. Rose stared, trying to understand, but after a few minutes, the light stopped and the house went completely dark. She tried to ignore what she saw and went back to bed, but the unease remained. She turned from side to side, her mind spinning with possibilities. Maybe he's having electrical problems, she thought, trying to convince herself that it was a logical explanation. However, a persistent voice in the back of her mind kept warning her that this was not normal. The following night, Rose was awoken by a strange sound. She looked at the clock. It was about 2 in the morning. The sound was faint but audible, a continuous scratching, as if something was being dragged across the floor. She got up and went to the window, where the sound seemed to be coming from. He looked at the neighbor's house, but it was dark, with no sign of movement. The street was deserted, lit only by the dim light of the street lamps. The sound stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more disturbing. Rose stood there for a long time, eyes fixed on the darkness, hoping to hear or see something that would explain what was happening. But nothing happened. Finally, exhausted, she went back to bed, the sound of the scratching still echoing in her mind. The next day, Rose discussed the strange noises with a friend over coffee in the city center. "Do you think I'm imagining things?" she asked, trying to mask the concern in her voice. "I don't know, Rose," her friend replied, frowning. "It could just be an animal. Or maybe he's renovating something in the house. You know these lonely guys. Sometimes they're a bit strange." But if you think something's wrong, maybe you should talk to him, or, I don't know, call the police, just to check." Rose shook her head, displeased. "I don't know about involving the police. He hasn't done anything wrong, yet." But the word "yet" hung in the air, making them both uncomfortable. That evening, on her way home, Rose felt a weight of anxiety in her chest. She looked at her neighbor's house, dark and silent as always. She decided it was time to try to get to know him better, even if only to satisfy her own curiosity and relieve the tension she had been feeling. She approached the fence that separated their yards and looked towards his house, hoping to see some sign of life. It was then that she noticed something that made her shudder. On the neighbor's lawn, near the basement window, there were a series of footprints marked in the damp earth. They were large and deep, as if someone had passed by several times, walking in circles. The marks were fresh, indicating that they had been made recently, perhaps the night before. Rose felt her heart racing. Something was definitely wrong. She looked around, hoping to see some sign of movement, but everything was quiet. The neighbor's curtains were closed, as always, hiding whatever was going on inside. With one last glance at the footprints, Rose turned away from the fence and went back into her house, locking the door behind her. She needed to think. She needed to decide what to do. But one thing was certain. The new neighbor wasn't just strange. He was dangerous. And Rose felt that she was getting closer and closer to discovering what he was hiding in that silent house. The next day, Rose decided that she needed to get out of the house. The tension of always keeping an eye on her new neighbor was beginning to affect her sanity. She needed to clear her head, and a trip to the market seemed like a good excuse for a change of scenery. After quickly getting ready, she grabbed her keys and left. He walked to his car, casting furtive glances at the house next door. The curtains remained closed, with no sign of movement. The market was bustling, full of people busy with their daily shopping. Rose pushed her trolley through the aisles, trying to concentrate on banal items such as fruit, vegetables, and cleaning products. The normal atmosphere and the sound of other customers chatting and laughing helped her relax. For a few moments, she was able to forget about her new neighbor and the strange events of the last few days. It was at the checkout line that the tranquility dissipated. As she approached the queue, Rose looked up and saw her neighbor standing just ahead, placing a few purchases on the checkout conveyor belt. He was wearing the same grey t-shirt and jeans that he had on moving day. His shoulders were broad but curved, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his back. For a moment, she hesitated, considering going to another line, but her impulse to understand who this man was won out. "Hello," said Rose, forcing a smile as she positioned herself behind him. "We meet again. You live next door to me, remember?" The man turned his head slowly in her direction, as if taken by surprise. His dark eyes met hers for a brief second before darting away again. Rose noticed that he didn't make eye contact for more than a moment, as if avoiding anyone looking into his soul. "Yes, I remember," he replied, his voice low and husky. There was no enthusiasm in his words, just a factual statement. He went back to his shopping, ignoring her completely. Trying not to be put off by the cold reception, Rose continued, "I'm Rose, by the way. And you?" The man paused, as if considering not answering, but then murmured, "Carlos." His voice was almost inaudible, as if the effort of speaking his own name was too much. "Nice to meet you, Carlos," said Rose, still smiling, although now the smile was more forced. "If you need anything, you know where to find me. The neighborhood is very friendly." Carlos didn't reply. He just finished putting his shopping in the trolley, gave a brief nod to the cashier, and headed for the exit, without looking back. Rose stood watching him walk away, feeling a mixture of frustration and apprehension. Something about his behavior made her deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just shyness or reclusiveness. There was something darker, a deliberate resistance to connecting with anyone. As Carlos left the market, Rose noticed that the cashier was talking to her, asking if she wanted bags. She excused herself and turned to pay for her purchases, but her mind remained fixed on her strange neighbor. When she finally left the market, she looked around for Carlos, but he had already disappeared. On the way home, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She wondered what Carlos did for a living, where he came from, and why someone would choose to live in such isolation. The lack of answers bothered her more than she wanted to admit. When she got home, she saw Carlos' car parked in the driveway, but he was nowhere in sight. Rose hurried inside, the key jingling slightly as she unlocked the door. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and stood still, listening. Everything was quiet, as it should be. But the silence seemed heavier, laden with secrets and shadows. She went to the kitchen, put the shopping on the table, and looked out of the window at Carlos' house. The curtains were still closed, but now Rose was sure there was someone behind them, watching. The image of Carlos' eyes, dark and evasive, continued to haunt her. That night, Rose locked all the doors and windows, checking each lock twice. Even so, it took her a long time to fall asleep. And when she finally did, her rest was troubled by strange dreams where shadows moved across the windows and dark eyes followed her everywhere. She woke up with a start several times, increasingly convinced that there was something terribly wrong with her new neighbor. Rose knew she needed to find out more about Carlos, but the thought of confronting him directly scared her. She could no longer ignore the feeling that something sinister was happening next door. Over the next few days, Rose couldn't shake the unease that was growing inside her. Each night, the feeling of being watched seemed to intensify, and each morning, new footprints appeared around Carlos' house, as if he was walking through the night, sleepless, trapped in a strange and unsettling ritualistic behavior. Rose began to feel paranoid, as if every shadow and noise was an imminent threat. One night, while watching television, Rose heard a faint sound coming from outside. The clock was almost midnight, and the street was silent, with all the neighbors probably asleep. She slowly got up from the sofa, her heart beating fast, and went to the living room window, peering through the curtain. At first, everything seemed normal. Carlos' house was dark, with no sign of lights or movement. But then she heard the sound again, a faint scratching, like something rubbing against a wooden surface. Rose frowned, trying to locate the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from somewhere between her house and Carlos. Carefully, she opened the front door and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold, and she felt a chill run through her body. She stood there, listening. The sound was repeated, this time a little louder, and Rose realized that it was coming from the side of the house, near the gate leading to the yard. The light from the street lamp cast long shadows on the ground, creating dancing, sinister shapes. Rose hesitated for a moment, her mind struggling between the desire to find out what was going on and the instinct to protect herself. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and walked slowly to the side of the house. The sound was clearer now, definitely a scratching against the wood. She reached the gate and, with trembling hands, opened it. What she saw made her heart almost stop. There was a figure crouched beside her house, scraping something against the wooden wall. For a moment, Rose thought it was an animal, but soon realized it was Carlos. He had his back to her, wearing a dark coat that made him blend into the shadows. In his hands, he held a small knife, which he used to scratch the wall, as if he were engraving something there. "Carlos?" Rose called out, her voice low and unsure. The figure froze for a second, before slowly standing up. Carlos turned to face her, his face partially hidden in the shadows. His eyes, however, shone in the dim light of the street lamp, and there was a strange expression on his face, a mixture of surprise and something darker, as if he had been caught in a forbidden act. "Rose," he said, his voice soft and drawn out. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" The question made Rose flinch. I heard a noise, she stammered, trying to sound firm. What are you doing? Carlos looked down at the knife in his hands, as if only now realizing that he was still holding it. Slowly, he put it back in his coat pocket and took a step towards Rose. She forced herself not to take any more steps back, staying firmly where she was, even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. "I'm sorry," said Carlos, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "Sometimes I have trouble sleeping. I walk around the neighborhood to calm down. I didn't mean to scare you." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained fixed on her, analyzing her every reaction. Rose tried to process the explanation. "You were scratching my wall," she said, pointing to the spot where he had been crouching. There were visible marks on the wood, irregular and incomplete lines, as if he was trying to draw something. Carlos looked at the marks, and then back at Rose. "Sorry about that too. Sometimes I need to distract myself. I promise I won't do it again." Rose didn't know what to say. There was something deeply disturbing about Carlos, something that went beyond his strangeness. He was lying, she was sure of it, but why? And what exactly was he doing there? "Okay," Rose said at last, trying to sound calm, "but I think you better go home now, Carlos. It's late." Carlos nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. "Yes, of course. Good night, Rose." He turned and walked towards his house, disappearing into the darkness. Rose stood still for a long time, her eyes fixed on the spot where he had disappeared, her heart still beating fast. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep that night. She went back inside and locked the door, checking all the windows and locks again. Before going back to bed, she took one last look out of the front window. Carlos' house was dark and silent, but Rose knew he was awake, watching. She could feel it. The sensation of being watched had never been so intense. From that moment on, Rose understood that she couldn't ignore what was happening. Carlos wasn't just a strange neighbor. He was dangerous, and Rose was determined to find out what he was hiding, even if it meant facing her worst fears. The next morning, Rose woke up to the first rays of sunlight coming through the curtains, but the restless night still weighed heavily on her mind. She had barely looked up, and her thoughts were filled with images of Carlos, crouched beside her house, scratching at the wood like a madman. She knew she had to do something about it, but she didn't know where to start. Something was clearly wrong, but she had no concrete proof, apart from her neighbor's strange behavior. Determining the truth became an obsession for Rose. She didn't want to alarm the other neighbors for no reason, so she decided to take discreet measures. After eating breakfast, she picked up the phone and called her friend Julie, who lived a few blocks away. Julie was known for knowing everything that was going on in the neighborhood and loved to share the news. "Hi, Julie. What's up?" Rose began, trying to sound casual. "Hi, Rose. Everything's great. How are you?" Julie replied cheerfully. "It's a beautiful day outside, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," Rose agreed. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Do you know anything about the new neighbor who moved in next door to me?" Julie paused, as if thinking. "Oh, the new guy. I think his name is Carlos, right? I don't know much about him. He seems pretty reserved, to be honest. I saw him a couple of times at the market, but he never said anything. Why do you ask?" Rose hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but she needed some information. "It's just that he seems a bit strange. Last night, I heard a noise outside, and when I went to check, I found him crouched near my house, scratching the wall with a knife. He said he had trouble sleeping, but I don't know, it doesn't seem right, you know?" Julie was silent for a few seconds. "Wow, that's really weird, Rose. Do you think he's dangerous? Maybe we should talk to someone about it." "I don't know," Rose admitted. "I just have a bad feeling about him. I wanted to find out more about what he does, where he came from, just to make sure." Julie sighed. "Maybe we could ask Mrs. Martins. She knows almost everyone who lives around here. She might know something about his past." Rose agreed, and the two arranged to meet at Mrs. Martin's house later that day. After hanging up the phone, Rose felt a small wave of relief. At least now she had a plan. As the sun began to descend over the horizon, Rose and Julie walked to Mrs. Martin's house, a friendly 80-year-old lady who had lived in the neighborhood since she had been married more than 50 years ago. She was known for her excellent memory and her delight in sharing stories from the past. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Martins," Julie greeted cheerfully when the lady opened the door. "Could we have a little chat? We have some questions." Sure, come on in, girls," Mrs. Martin said, smiling. She led them into the living room, offering tea and cookies, which Rose accepted more out of politeness than hunger. After a few minutes of small talk, Julie got straight to the point. "So, Mrs. Martins, do you know anything about the new neighbor who moved in next door to Rose, a man called Carlos?" Mrs. Martin's expression changed subtly. She was thoughtful for a moment before answering, "Oh yes, Carlos. I heard that he bought the house from a distant relative who passed away. A lonely man as far as I know. I don't have much information about him. It seems he came from another city, but I don't know which one. All I know is that he moved here very quickly after the house was put up for sale. They say he paid cash, which I found a bit strange." Rose exchanged a worried glance with Julie. Something in Mrs. Martin's tone suggested that she knew more than she was willing to reveal. "Mrs. Martins," Rose said softly, "do you think he could be dangerous? I found him doing strange things near my house, and I'm worried." Mrs. Martins looked at Rose with a serious expression. "Darling, I don't like to judge anyone without knowing them, but I hear things. People say he has a troubled past, perhaps involved in legal problems. But nothing has been proven, of course. He'd say, be careful. It's always good to be cautious with people you don't know well." Rose thanked Mrs. Martins for the talk and exchanged a meaningful glance with Julie. As they left the house, the weight of Mrs. Martin's words pressed down on Rose's shoulders. She was right about Carlos. There was something very wrong with him. Later that evening, Rose sat on the sofa in the living room, staring at the window that overlooked Carlos' house. The curtains were closed as usual, but now she knew there was something dark behind them. She needed to find out more about him, but how? She couldn't go on living with this feeling of constant fear. She needed answers. Suddenly, an idea occurred to her. Perhaps she should try to contact Carlos' former residents or neighbors. Someone should know more about him, something that could explain his strange behavior and the secrets he seemed to be hiding. Determined, Rose grabbed her laptop and started searching for information online, hoping to find something, anything, that would give her clues about the man who had become her obsession. She knew she was playing with fire, but her need for answers outweighed her fear. As she typed into the search bar, a warning message appeared on her screen. "Connection problems. Try again." Rose huffed in frustration and looked at her watch. It was already late. Perhaps it would be better to leave the investigations until the next day, when her mind would be clearer and her internet connections more stable. Before getting up, Rose took one last look out of the window. The darkness seemed more oppressive, and the silhouette of Carlos' house stood out against the night sky. Suddenly, a light flashed rapidly on the second floor, and Rose held her breath, remembering the flashing lights she had seen before. She knew that somehow this was a message, a sign that something terrible was happening, something she could no longer ignore. She was determined to find out what it was, whatever the cost. The night was difficult for Rose. Her dreams were disturbed by confusing and disturbing images of Carlos, shadows moving stealthily around her house, and the mysterious sounds she had heard. When the sun finally rose, she felt a temporary sense of relief. Daylight always seemed to bring a sense of security, however temporary. After breakfast, Rose decided she needed to take action. Carlos' behavior was making her increasingly uneasy, and the clues she had uncovered were increasing her suspicions. Determined to better understand what was going on, Rose decided to visit one of the former residents of the house next to Carlos. The house had recently been sold, but the previous residents were still in town and were known to many neighbors. She found the former resident, an elderly woman called Edith, in a local coffee shop. Edith was willing to talk and seemed excited to share her memories of the old neighborhood. "So, Edith," Rose began, after greetings and a little chat about the weather and health, "do you remember the former owner of the house next to mine, the gentleman who lived there before Carlos moved in?" Edith paused, her expression becoming a little more serious. "Oh yes, he was a lonely man, and I always thought there was something strange about him. He lived there for many years, but he was reserved, never talking much to his neighbors. In the end, it seemed like he was hiding something. I don't know what exactly. After his death, the house was empty for a long time." "Strange," said Rose, trying to disguise the concern in her voice. "Carlos bought the house and moved in recently. He doesn't seem to fit the typical profile of the neighbors here." Edith looked at Rose curiously. "Do you think he's doing something wrong?" Rose hesitated. "I don't know, but he's been showing some very peculiar behavior. He was seen near my house at night, scratching the wall with a knife. On top of that, he's been doing strange things like leaving the lights flashing. All this has me worried." Edith frowned. "If you have a bad feeling, it's best to be careful. It's always good to be alert when something doesn't feel right. If you need to, you can talk to the police. Maybe they can investigate discreetly." With these words of caution, Rose thanked Edith and said goodbye. On the way home, her thoughts were more agitated than ever. Her concern for Carlos seemed to have reached a critical point. She needed to do something to protect herself, and perhaps even her other neighbors. When she got home, she found a note on the door, handwritten and unsigned. The note read, "You're meddling where you don't belong. Better stay out of it." Rose was paralyzed, the paper trembling in her hands. The message was clear. Someone knew she was investigating Carlos and was trying to intimidate her. Her heart racing, Rose decided she couldn't ignore the threat. She needed to carry out a more thorough investigation at Carlos' house. She waited until it was dark. Then, equipped with a flashlight and a cell phone camera, she went to the backyard gate of Carlos' house. The curtains were still closed, and the house seemed deserted. She walked carefully around the house, trying to avoid making any noise. When she reached the side of the basement, where she had seen the footprints the night before, she decided to see if there was any way in. The basement window was slightly open, and with great care, Rose managed to force it open so that she could pass through. The basement was dark and dusty. Rose used the flashlight to illuminate her surroundings. There were stacked boxes and furniture covered with dusty sheets. The feeling that she was invading someone's privacy made her stomach turn, but the need for answers overcame the discomfort. While examining the basement, he found a number of strange objects. There were various gardening tools, but what caught her eye was an old notebook on a table in the corner. Rose approached, picking up the notebook with trembling hands. She opened it and found pages full of disturbing drawings and handwritten notes. The drawings were of eyes, hands, and distorted figures. The notes were in erratic and unclear English, but they mentioned something about rituals and preparations. His heart was pounding. This wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. Rose knew she had to get out of there before she was discovered. She carefully put the notebook away and headed for the window she had entered through. With one last look at the basement, she left and closed the window behind her. On returning home, Rose was exhausted and nervous. What she had found in Carlos' house was a clear sign that something much darker was going on. She needed to act quickly, but she also needed to plan carefully. She decided that the next step would be to talk to the police, but she also knew that she needed to have more concrete evidence to ensure that they took the situation seriously. That night, as she prepared for bed, Rose couldn't get the drawings and notes out of her head. The feeling of fear and apprehension seemed to have become a constant presence. The shadow of Carlos' house seemed even closer, and Rose knew that she was getting closer to discovering the truth. And the truth could be more frightening than she had ever imagined. The next morning, Rose was determined to take action. The notebook she found in Carlos' basement contained information she couldn't ignore. The contents were disturbing and suggested that there was something much more sinister behind Carlos' actions. She knew she needed to take this evidence to the police, but she wanted to be prepared for what they might say or do. After a quick breakfast, Rose went to the local police station. The feeling of nervousness was almost unbearable, but she knew she couldn't hesitate. She entered the building and went up to the reception desk. "Hello, I'd like to speak to a detective about a security issue," said Rose, trying to keep her voice steady. An officer led her to the office of a detective called John Miller, a middle-aged man with a tired but attentive expression. After a brief introduction, Rose began to explain the situation. "Detective Miller, I have a neighbor, Carlos, who recently moved in next door to me. He's been exhibiting some very strange behavior. This morning, I found a notebook in his house while I was investigating the property." She handed the notebook to the detective, who began leafing through it as Rose continued. "The notebook is full of drawings and notes. I'm no expert, but it looks like he's involved in something much more serious than simple weirdness. There are mentions of rituals and preparations." The detective examined the notebook carefully, his eyebrows furrowed in concentration. "That's really disturbing. He'll need a copy of this for our archive." "You said you found this material in his house, right?" Rose confirmed. "Yes, I went into the basement. The things I saw there are quite disturbing. I also have a feeling that he's watching me. He's been very discreet and reserved, but his behavior is getting stranger and stranger." Detective Miller looked at Rose with a thoughtful expression. "It's good that you've brought this to our attention. I'm going to ask one of our officers to go to his house to do a check. It's important to make sure we're handling the situation properly. However, I need you to be careful and avoid any direct confrontation with him. It could be dangerous." Rose agreed, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Thank you, Detective. I'll take your advice." After saying goodbye, Rose returned home, the notebook now in the hands of the police. She tried to distract herself with her daily chores, but her anxiety wouldn't let up. Every noise, every shadow seemed to be amplifying her fear. That night, when darkness fell over the neighborhood, Rose decided to watch Carlos' house again. She was determined to find out what was going on, but now she did so with the hope that the police were already doing their bit. As she watched Carlos' house from the window, she saw a movement that made her hold her breath. A police car was parked across the street. 2 officers were in front of Carlos' house, talking to him. Rose couldn't hear what was being said, but she watched the conversation tensely. After a few minutes, the officers left and the police car drove off. Carlos stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the car drive away. His expression was a mixture of irritation and suspicion, but he didn't seem to be aware that Rose was watching him. After the officers left, Carlos went back into his house and turned off the lights. Rose was restless, trying to understand what could have happened. Had the police found something? Had they confronted Carlos? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. The next day, Rose received a call from Detective Miller. "Rose, we did a preliminary investigation at Carlos' house, but we didn't find anything compromising. The notebook you provided us with is being analyzed, but for now, there isn't enough evidence to take more serious action. However, we will continue to monitor the situation. If you notice anything else strange, please let us know immediately." Rose felt frustrated. She had hoped that the police visit would have some impact, but it seemed that Carlos was managing to avoid any significant repercussions for the time being. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and the uncertainty about what Carlos might be planning continued to plague her. That night, Rose decided that she needed to find out more. If the police couldn't do anything for the time being, perhaps she could find some crucial detail that had escaped the authorities' control. With renewed determination, Rose planned her next move: to dig deeper into Carlos' past, looking for any clue that might shed light on his intentions and confirm her suspicions. As the sun set and night settled in again, Rose prepared herself for a new surveillance. What else could she find out? What else was Carlos hiding? Fear and curiosity guided her as she prepared for the next chapter of her investigation. Over the next few days, Rose didn't have much luck in her search for additional information about Carlos. Her attempt to find more details about Carlos passed on the internet had not yielded any great results. The feeling of frustration was beginning to turn into a constant pressure in her chest. She knew she had to find a way to get more information, and the police, despite monitoring the situation, didn't seem to have discovered anything new. With this growing frustration, Rose decided to change her approach. Instead of focusing solely on online research, she decided to try a more direct approach, visiting public records and local archives to find out more about Carlos' life. It was a monumental effort, but it seemed to be the only way to find concrete clues about the man who was causing so much disquiet. Rose headed to the city records office, where she began researching information about the property and its previous owners. She examined sales files and property records, trying to find any detail that might shed light on Carlos. As she rummaged through the documents, she found a file that looked promising. It was a record of a previous sale of the house to a relative of Carlos, who had recently died. From this file, Rose obtained the name of the relative, something that could help her in her search. After leaving the records office, Rose decided to visit the address associated with Carlos' relative. She knew it might seem like an invasion of privacy, but her instinct told her she had to go ahead. The address led her to an old, shabby house in a less trafficked part of town. She was greeted by an elderly man who seemed surprised to see her. After a brief conversation, Rose discovered that Carlos' relative, called Henry, had lived in the house until his recent death. Henry was not well known in the neighborhood, and information about him was scarce. The elderly man, who was a neighbor of Henry's, reported that Henry had been a recluse, with few visitors and limited social relations. "If you want to know more about Henry, perhaps you could talk to Mrs. Wilkins," said the neighbor. She was a friend of his many years ago, before he became so isolated. With a new direction, Rose thanked the man and headed to the home of Mrs. Wilkins, an elderly woman who lived in a nearby neighborhood. Mrs. Wilkins was known in the community for her sharp memory and her ability to recall past events. Upon arriving, Rose was greeted warmly by Mrs. Wilkins and quickly introduced the reason for her visit. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'm doing some research on Henry, Carlos' relative who recently moved in next door to me. I heard you were friends in the past. Do you remember anything about him that might help me understand the situation better?" Mrs. Wilkins frowned, as if trying to remember old details. "Oh, Henry. Yes, I remember him. He was a peculiar man, but I never thought he was dangerous. He was always reserved, and there was something strange about his behavior. He spoke little about his past, but I know he had some rather shady interests. He collected strange things and had an interest in ancient and, well, not very common practices." Rose became attentive. "Do you know if he had any contact with people outside the city, or if he had any involvement with specific groups?" Mrs. Wilkins paused, thoughtful. "There were rumors about him being involved with some occult organizations, but they were just rumors. Nobody knew for sure. He never confirmed anything. I only know that, after his wife's death, he isolated himself even more and started getting involved in strange activities, but I can't guarantee anything." This information added a new layer to the mystery. Rose thanked Mrs. Wilkins and returned home, more determined than ever. She knew that Carlos had inherited something from Henry, and that this was contributing to his current behavior. With these new discoveries, Rose began to put together a clearer profile of what might be going on. Carlos was following some kind of practice or ritual that Henry had left for him. This line of thought led her to consider the possibility that Carlos' behavior could be part of a tradition or a wider plan. That night, Rose decided that she needed to contact Detective Miller again. What she had discovered about Henry and the strange activities only increased the need for further investigation. She called the detective and reported the new information she had obtained. "Detective Miller, I spoke to some old acquaintances of Henry's, and it seems that he was involved in unconventional practices and had an interest in occult organizations. I don't know if this is relevant to the current situation, but it seems that Carlos may be following some kind of tradition or ritual that Henry left for him." Detective Miller listened attentively. "That's valuable information, Rose. He'll instruct our team to investigate further into Henry's past and his possible associations. Thank you for keeping us informed. Well, increase surveillance on Carlos' house and check for any connection to occult activities." With a sigh of relief, Rose ended the call and tried to relax. She felt she was making progress, but fear and uncertainty continued to haunt her. She knew she was getting closer to the truth, but she also knew that the road to unraveling it could be dangerous. As the night wore on, Rose prepared herself for what would come next, determined to reveal the dark secrets that Carlos was hiding. The next day began with a climate of growing tension. Rose had spent the night reviewing all the information she had collected and planning her next move. The feeling that she was approaching something big didn't leave her in peace. The combination of the evidence and Carlos' unsettling behavior put her in a constant state of alert. At dawn, Rose received an unexpected call from Detective Miller. "Rose, we have news. Our investigation into Henry's past and his associations has revealed something worrying. We discovered that Henry was involved with a sect that practiced ancient rituals, and that apparently he had passed on some of these interests and practices to Carlos." The revelation stunned Rose. "Are you saying that Carlos is involved with a sect?" "Yes, that's right. And it seems that he is following some of the traditions that Henry left behind. Now, with this new information, we have a better understanding of what might be going on. Our team did a more detailed search of Carlos' house and found materials that confirm his involvement with occult rituals and practices. For safety's sake, we decided to take a more careful approach to avoid any dangerous situation." Rose felt a sense of relief mixed with apprehension. "And what are you going to do now?" "We're planning an operation to intervene at Carlos' house. We're also going to alert the neighbors and reinforce security in the area. If you notice any strange activity, please contact us immediately." Rose thanked the detective and decided that the best approach would be to wait and watch, respecting the authorities' plans. She felt that the operation could solve the mystery, but her anxiety was not diminishing. That night, Rose kept one last vigil around Carlos' house. The darkness seemed more oppressive than ever, and every shadow seemed to carry a hidden meaning. As she watched the house, she noticed a subtle movement, a light flashing at the back of the house where the basement was located. It was a clear sign that Carlos was active in his home. From the police radio, Rose knew that the operation was about to begin. She waited anxiously as the hours slowly passed. Finally, the lights of the police cars began to approach, and the movement in the streets indicated that the intervention was about to take place. Rose watched from afar as the officers entered the estate. They moved with precision, and a team of specialists in deactivating risky situations was present. Rose remained silent, waiting for any sign that the situation was being brought under control. The operation was meticulously planned. The officers entered the house cautiously, checking every room and confirming Carlos' presence. After a thorough search, they found several items related to the rituals described earlier and several documents confirming Carlos' connection to the sect. Detective Miller contacted Rose as soon as the operation was complete. "Rose, the operation was successful. We found enough material to ensure that Carlos is involved in occult and dangerous practices. He has been taken in for questioning and the area is now safe." Rose felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Detective. I'm very relieved that everything ended well. You did an excellent job putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Your vigilance and courage were crucial to solving this case. If you have any other information or notice anything unusual, please let us know immediately." With a sigh of relief, Rose ended the call and decided it was time to rest. The tension that had built up over the last few weeks was finally starting to ease, and she felt a new sense of peace, knowing that the threat had been neutralized. Over the next few days, life in her neighborhood began to return to normal. Carlos had been formally charged and would face justice for his actions. Rose received praise from her neighbors for her vigilance and courage, but for her, the real relief was knowing that the situation was under control. She reflected on the events and how much they had changed her perspective on security and vigilance. The fear she had felt was now transformed into a renewed sense of protection and attention to detail around her. Although the mystery of Carlos had been solved, Rose knew that the experience had changed the way she saw the world. She also knew that however much things had calmed down, vigilance and attention to the signs around her would continue to be an important part of her life. With a sense of closure, Rose closed the door to her house and looked around the neighborhood, feeling grateful that she had found the strength to face the unknown and solve the riddle that had threatened her tranquility. She knew that, while the fear of the unknown might still haunt her from time to time, the courage and determination she had shown had been her greatest allies.